You practiced this morning, maybe revision, maybe SATs, maybe a quiet scripting session before the day started, and for a while it held. The certainty was real, you felt the thing is done, and something in you settled. Then the day began. By 9, you were answering emails. By 10, you had a conversation that reminded you of how things actually are. By noon, the feeling from this morning was already a memory. The certainty you built with deliberate attention had dissolved on its own, without your permission, without you doing anything obviously wrong. This is the part that breaks most practitioners. Not the morning session, which they know how to do. The part they cannot explain is the vanishing. Why does the state hold perfectly for 1 hour and then get eaten alive by the next 11? I want to show you what is actually eating it. Because it is not doubt, it is not weak belief, and it is not a flaw in your technique. By the end of this video, you will know exactly which mechanism is undoing your state and what Neville himself demonstrated about how to stop it. Let me start with Neville himself. In 1943, Neville Goddard was drafted into the United States Army at the age of 38. He was stationed at Camp Polk in Louisiana. He had a New York apartment he wanted to return to, a teaching practice he wanted to resume, and every official reason to be exactly where the army needed him to be. He had no grounds for early release. The situation was closed. Every night in the barracks, Neville did something specific. He did not perform an elaborate visualization ritual. He did not spend hours generating peak emotional states. He would lie down on his bunk and feel himself already in his New York apartment. He would feel the mattress of his own bed, the specific weight of his own room. Not a heroic practice, not a disciplined regimen. He simply held that assumption, quietly, as his last waking posture. After approximately 9 days, the army granted him an honorable discharge under a specific regulation. 9 days, no petition, no exception, no obvious explanation. Now here is what I want you to pay close attention to. Those 9 days were not 9 days of meditation. They were 9 days of ordinary army life, drills, barracks noise, meals in a mess hall. Nothing about Neville's external circumstances supported the assumption. But the assumption held anyway, not because Neville was performing it every waking second, but because he had settled into it as his natural posture. It ran underneath the day. That is the thing almost every modern teacher leaves unnamed. There is a precise quality inside those 9 days that determines whether any assumption you plant does the same or collapses. It is not what most people guess. I will name it in a few minutes, because without it, the technique stays something you visit rather than something you inhabit. In his work from the early 1950s, Neville wrote that consciousness is the only reality. The LOA space turns this into a motivation poster, meaning stay positive, you create your reality. They are wrong about what it means, and that misreading is exactly where the practice breaks down. What Neville meant was structural. Your state of consciousness is not the event during your practice session, it is what you are walking in at any given moment. The practice session seeds it, but the state itself is something you either sustain or abandon without noticing. This is the part of his 1952 work most people read once and move past. It is the most important paragraph in that book. Now let's name what is dismantling yours. The moment a focused practice session ends, something very predictable happens. The analytical mind re-engages. The ordinary self-concept reinstates. Not sabotage, not doubt in the spiritual sense. This is the older, more practiced identity asserting itself by sheer repetition. Your habitual self-concept has been running for decades. It is the default. Your assumption, depending on how recently you planted it, is newer. And new does not beat old on habit alone. The way inner conversation is taught across nearly every modern LOA course is backwards. Teachers reduce it to affirmations, to scripting what you want. Neville never taught that. What he pointed at was the automatic monologue. The mind runs beneath deliberate thought all day, without instruction. The low-level signal about who you are, what you have, what today looks like. That signal is not something you script. It is something you either interrupt or leave running. And if you leave it running on its habitual content, It broadcasts the old identity to the subconscious across 23 hours your morning session did not cover. One deliberate hour, 23 hours of automatic inner conversation. That is the arithmetic of the fade. Now here is the part most teachers skip. There is a specific signal the inner conversation sends just before the default fully reinstates. If you know it, you can interrupt. If you do not, the default completes without resistance. I will point to that signal exactly in the protocol section. Actually, let me correct something. I said automatic, as though it is entirely outside your control. That is not quite right. The automatic monologue is not scriptable in advance, but it is interruptible. Neville's teaching from his Brooklyn lectures in the late 1940s was that the inner conversation can be caught and replaced with a posture of assumption. The skill is not managing the whole monologue. It is noticing the moment the old one reinstates and placing a single different signal there. Remember the 9 days in Louisiana. What Neville sustained across those days was not a performance, it was a decision, and decisions can be reintroduced at any moment. There is a type of practitioner I have watched in the patterns of people who come to this teaching and report the same frustration month after month. They do SATs every night. They script, they revise, they practice with genuine care. The feeling is real during the session, real enough to trust. Then morning comes. They get up, check their phone. Within 90 minutes, three separate triggers have reinstated the habitual self-concept. Not because they decided to doubt, because the default inner conversation restarted the moment focused attention was not actively redirecting it. By the time they sit down to work or step into a conversation, they are operating from the old identity. By noon, the morning session feels like it happened to someone else. Here is the full arc. The starting state is a practitioner doing everything the technique requires. The friction is this exact sequence, the morning work dissolving before noon. The turning point comes when they stop trying to make the morning session stronger and start identifying the first moment the old state reinstalls. Within a few weeks, the afternoon state begins to match the morning one, not because they added more practice, because they started attending to the hours between sessions. If you want to go deeper on identifying your specific trigger point, there is a free diagnostic in the description. It is called the source code diagnostic and it is built to show you exactly where in your day the state architecture breaks down. The link is below. Now here is the application. 3 concrete moves starting tonight. If you have been practicing consistently for weeks and still watch the state dissolve by noon, the problem is not your morning technique and it is not your belief quality. The problem is the unmanaged hours between sessions. First, tonight, identify your reinstall trigger. The specific first moment in your day. A glance at your phone, a certain conversation, a look in a mirror where the inner conversation shifts back to the old identity. This is the irreversible point I mentioned. Name it concretely. Not when I start feeling doubt, but the specific event. Second, create one interruption practice for that exact moment, not a new full session. One deliberate retrieval of the morning's assumption at the trigger point, 15 seconds, enough to notice the shift before the default completes itself. That gap between the old inner conversation starting and locking in is the signal I was pointing toward. It is narrower than you think, and it is where everything is decided. Third, audit your noon inner conversation. Not the deliberate thoughts you have been thinking, but the background hum. What is the mind saying underneath at the midpoint of your day? That is what the subconscious has been receiving since your morning session ended. That is what is building. Nothing here requires unusual discipline or extended hours. It requires attention to the hours you have been leaving unattended. That attention is available to every practitioner, regardless of how long they have been studying. The reason the state fades by lunchtime is not that your morning practice was weak. It is that morning practice, no matter how precise, is designed to cover 1 hour. The other 23 hours have their own architecture. And if you leave that architecture unattended, the default identity fills it automatically. The practice session opens the window. The unmanaged hours decide whether anything comes through it. Seeing that is the straightforward part. Once you know the arithmetic, the diagnosis writes itself. The harder part is closing the gap. The work lives in the ordinary hours no one has ever asked you to pay attention to before. Diagnosing the problem is easy to give away. The protocol for closing it is a different kind of instruction, and it is the piece almost no one walks you through. There is a specific next step for anyone who wants to move from the diagnosis to the architecture. If you want the feeling from your morning practice to still be running at 3 in the afternoon, the tool that shows you how is the source code diagnostic. It is a free guide that maps exactly where the default identity reinstalls in your specific day and gives you the interruption sequence for each point. You will find it linked in the description below. Tonight before sleep, do not add a new technique. Instead, do one thing. Identify the single earliest moment in tomorrow's day when the old inner conversation is most likely to restart. Just name it. Put attention on the gap, not only on the practice. In his teachings from the early 1940s, Neville said, "Your feeling is your prayer, not your morning feeling, your feeling full stop across all the hours you inhabit." The work is not in the session is the seed. The work is in the soil.